Welcome to my YouTube channel, Truth in Motion Studios. I'm Christina Zakowski, and I have New Testament Professor Thorsten Moritz with me today. Welcome, Thorsten.
Hello, how are you? Is this rare that somebody pronounces my name correctly? Well done.
Yes, and why is he bringing this up? Yes, he is a fellow German who made it all the way over the big blue thing, and here we are finding ourselves talking about theology. Good stuff. So, Thorsten, let me give you a little bit of a background. Someone who's watching my channel actually connected us, and we already, without knowing it, know a similar person, the same person actually, and that is Pastor Ryan, whom I interviewed twice for my channel. Yeah, so Thorsten, you were Pastor Ryan's professor for theology back when he went to Bethel, which is a seminary, or it's a big school with also a seminary wing in Minnesota. So if you're not from Minnesota, you've never heard of Bethel in that context, but you've heard of the other big Bethel, which it's kind of also a topic that we discuss here on my channel, not so much Bethel by name, but spiritual abuse and all that funky theology. So what we will be discussing today is nothing less than, New Testament theology, how spiritual abuse is important to Thorsten, what he has observed as a professor, why he stopped working at Bethel, and we'll round everything up with his understanding of the gospel and also his vision of the church. So I will pick his brain and ask him every question that comes to mind about spiritual abuse. And he graciously already talked to me before, and this could end up being a long talk, but I will just get right into my first question, and I hope you stick with us. So Thorsten, tell us a bit more about who are you and what do you used to do? What did you used to do, and what are you currently doing?
Yeah, so I'm German. I grew up in the Black Forest. My first relationship with the United States, where I live now, Minneapolis, my first relationship was actually when I was an exchange student, and for 1 year in Pennsylvania. Then went back to Germany, had to finish high school. After finishing high school in Pennsylvania, I had to do it again in Germany a couple of years later. And then eventually I became I studied theology in Germany. I became a professor. My postgraduate work is in London. I was a professor in London and generally in England in a couple of places for quite a few years. And then I was invited to come to Minnesota, become a professor there of New Testament and Hermeneutics. And that was important to me, that hermeneutics was part of it, about how humans, process stuff and interpret stuff and so on. So that's how I ended up in Minnesota. And then I was a professor at Bethel Seminary for many years. Then at another seminary, the first one, by the way, was just Bethel Conservative. I didn't care because I'm into hermeneutics, into how humans are being human, not whether they're liberal or conservative. But then after that, I went to a really liberal seminary where I also didn't care that it was liberal, because it was a bigger story, which is that of humanity. And so after that, I was asked to start a graduate school. Actually, by one of the two, I was asked to start a graduate school. And I did that, but that was limited to 3 years. And then after that, I decided I'm going to also do the same thing and do it radically differently, because I don't believe that theological education is half the thing it could be.
It's half the thing it could be.
Not even half the thing it could be.
Yeah, okay. Well, that is a charged or loaded statement, as we say. So you have a very exciting life. It's very busy, and you travel a lot and have international ties, and you work with grad students, so students who want to become acquire a PhD in theology.
Right.
So really next level, reading the Bible, and not this whole, it says there in one sentence, God says this one thing. So well, this is God speaking to me in my life. We discussed already a little bit about the problems that many people that come out of toxic groups end up having with reading the Bible at all, because we were trained to look at the Bible and just be like, oh, this is God's word into your situation. And if it talks about punishment and judgment, impending doom, whatnot, it's about my life. So it's like a horoscope. That's how we were taught to read the Bible. And it was very scary to the point where we couldn't read it anymore, which of course is spiritual abuse. Now, I would, before we talk more about what the Bible, how you understand the Bible should be read, what is up with the topic of spiritual abuse? Why is it interesting to you, or fundamental faith?
Well, it became interesting to me over the years being a professor. So if you're a professor and you have, I don't know the exact number, but let's say approximately in my case, maybe 18 to 20,000 students over the decades in different countries, you hear a lot of stories, and some of those stories are deep and are tragic. Not all of them, thankfully, but quite a few of them are. So as a professor, if you have any interest either in this thing that it's called hermeneutics, how humans tick, or your interest just in people. Sorry, my situation here is a little unstable physically with a phone setup. If you have any interest in the people that you're teaching and you hear these stories, you have to get into it. You have to get to the bottom of it, and you have to figure out what are some of the reasons for it. Now, I'm not coming at this primarily from the perspective of personal experience. I come at more, but it's important that people do that. I know you do that, and plenty of other people. I come at it from a different perspective, which is what are the systemics behind spiritual abuse? What are the structures behind spiritual abuse? But that's how I got into it, because of basically hearing student feedback for years. And I'm in a coffee shop right now. That was a last minute decision for this, but like this very coffee shop, as well as countless coffee shops around the Twin Cities, in Minneapolis, St. Paul, I've sat with students who've told me these heartrending stories of abuse that they experienced. And so, of course, I had to get into it.
Give me an idea. What would a student be saying about how they experienced spiritual abuse? Did they know it was spiritual abuse?
Well, they usually found out it was that during seminary, their seminary time. So for some students, the most important thing wasn't necessarily some of the content that they learned at seminary. I mean, that too. But the most important thing for a lot of students was to suddenly realize that there are certain things that should be considered normal, and there are certain things that should be considered deeply immoral. I switched from normal to moral, immoral, and abnormal, if you want both of those words. And the way they found that out is by, ironically, by being given an idealized picture of church. That's a very deep irony, actually. An idealized picture of church that I think is not realistic, and that itself is problematic, that seminaries tend to promulgate that. But ironically, it often had the effect of showing people that what they're experiencing is far from that. And so they're developing an awareness of that thing that feels so very wrong in their environment, the way they're treated by leaders and by people who are considered important in the church and, in their local church and so on, or by the denomination and whatnot. That the thing that doesn't feel normal at all shouldn't feel normal because it's abnormal and it's immoral. So they learn that at seminary. But the interesting question, in my case, a lot of them learned it at seminary, but the interesting question is not, should they then simply switch into the model that's being promoted to them in seminary? Or is something else needed? And my answer to that is very clearly, it is the system that seminaries have promoted and promulgated alongside churches that have made this abuse possible. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that certain systems automatically lead to abuse, but they make abuse possible. And it's a very deep, deep and dark situation. And somebody needs to look at it. So not just from the personal perspective, me, or him or her, from the systemic perspective. And that's pretty much how I got into it, and that's what I've been doing.
Yeah. A lot of people who are watching my videos that I create here with interviewing people or sharing my own thoughts, they are often not ready to say, I'm done with church. They are usually asking, so where can I find a healthy church? And then usually to that, my response is, well, good luck, but here are some tips for like healthy relationships. This is how normal, should look like. And then often they realize it's hard to maintain that. But there's also people who find themselves done. You get burned too many times and you're like, I want to do faith.
The dones.
Yeah, that have been theirs and done that. Well, we can jump ahead and cover that. What do you think your vision of church looks like? What did Jesus mean with the rock? Peter, on this rock I will build my church.
Well, that Peter reference right at the end there is extremely intriguing. I would like us to consider something here. Yeah. So Jesus picks 12 disciples who, throughout the Gospels, all of them, and especially the so-called synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, achieve very, very little and who present themselves in a very negative light. I'm not making this up, just read the Gospels. I mean, find a passage in Mark, for instance, where the disciples that were chosen by Jesus as leaders, including aforementioned Peter, show me a passage in Mark's Gospel, for instance, where they got something right, other than getting up and following Jesus in the first place, and see what else. They found the upper room and they picked up a donkey. Other than that, to my knowledge, they got nothing right. And again, if people are shocked by me saying this, just go and read the text and then send me an email and say you missed something.
But the one thing that comes to mind is Peter, you said Mark, I'm not sure. I know this is Matthew, but maybe it's also Mark, but Peter, realizing Jesus is the Christ.
Well,
only a few verses later getting rebuked for being, Satan, get behind me.
Right, because his understanding of what it means for Jesus to be the Christ was itself highly toxic. Now Matthew doesn't tell us that with the clarity that the others do, Mark and Luke. Why not? Because, well, starting with Mark and Luke, those two were written for an audience of mostly Gentiles who were interested in coming across and joining Judaism, and who feel unworthy. And so neither Mark nor Luke have a problem pointing out that the actual Jews in the story are far from perfect. In fact, they're a disaster. And Peter, with his big mouth, is always at the front of disaster in the Gospels. Now, Matthew has a different audience. Matthew's writing for Jews, and so it's not helpful for Matthew to focus on, here is what it means for you guys to be a Jew. That's not what he wants to say. So he is more selective in the material that he presents, just like any newspaper selects material and doesn't print everything that comes their way. And so if you read Matthew, the Peter situation there doesn't look quite as bad as it does over in Mark. In Mark 8, it's one of those many disasters that Peter gets involved in.
Okay, and so you're saying Jesus picked these 12 people who were very motivated and hardly understood what the whole thing was about. Right,
and now here's where it gets really interesting. So he picked the 12, and those 12, we call them apostles, though the New Testament actually outside of the Gospels, after the Gospels, that is in Acts and in Paul's letters especially, that talk about the 12, end up taking the term apostle and actually widening it so much. Paul calls literally hundreds of people apostles, not by name, but in 1 Corinthians, he does that very clearly. People that we've never heard of are being called apostles by Paul, for instance, at the end of Romans, in Romans 16. So you have 1 Corinthians, you have Romans, First Corinthians, that's in chapter 15. Romans is chapter 16. So despite all that, the interesting thing to me is that the church, which with its pyramid structure, which opens the door to the possibility of abuse. It doesn't cause abuse, but it opens the door to it, and pretty wide. The church needs some kind of New Testament precedent or some kind of basis on which to argue this pyramidical thing. So they go to the apostles, among others, to say, look, Jesus himself, he called leaders who are supposed to be at the top.
Yeah.
But when you then track the development of those leaders, you're now leaving the Gospels behind. They achieve almost nothing in the Gospels, almost nothing. You go into the second half of the story, which is Acts, which is basically volume 2 of Luke's Gospel, which is volume 1. You go into Acts, and you find that within the first 6 chapters, so that's less than a quarter of the entire story. 11 of the 12 are completely done. They don't play a role anymore. That's incredible. They've been prepared for a few years, but they rejected Jesus's vision of community and went instead with a pyramidical understanding. So when he told them to get out and basically be a helpful God-inspired humanity and take that throughout the Roman Empire, they're saying, no, we're actually staying here and we want to hang by the temple. So they hang by the temple. And the story passes them by. The story completely passes them by. The stuff that gets achieved in Acts by disciples is a lot, but it's not the 12 or the 11 or the 13, however you want to count them. What do I mean by that? Well, after Judas, they replace him with Matthias in chapter 1. It's absolutely a terrible idea that they even did that. It was Peter's idea, it sounds like, from Acts 1. But he had no basis for it. He had to pretty much rape the Old Testament text that he's quoting in order to find some kind of basis for replacing Judas. They set the parameters. God has nothing to do with it. Jesus has nothing to do with it. They just go and do it. And then the dude, I hope he had a good day, because we never hear from him again, nor do we hear the other 11. Only Peter hangs around. And even Peter has to learn from the no-names. The no-names are running the show with the help of the Holy Spirit in Acts. Not the 11, not the 12. And yet it's the 11 or the 12 or the 13, however you want to count them, with Judas, Matthias, whatever. They are the ones who are used by those who argue for the pyramidical church, which is just about every single church, to my knowledge, with very few exceptions. They are used as an argument for building this kind of structure, when in fact they represent the utter failure of that structure. Now, I know this is hard to take for some people, but I didn't write the text. And I'm not changing the text either. If somebody comes and says, hey, that's not what I'm seeing in the text, then I want to hear from that person.
Okay, I think I've really appreciated about you, and Ryan witnesses to that too, that you definitely have your strong perspective. That's how you read it, and that's you can defend it if you will, though you don't, you don't have any eggs in defending that successfully or whatever. But you definitely give space for people to disagree amicably, and that is much needed. Now, what I hear you say is that my cult, for instance, they were all about that first church, 2000 years ago. They if we could go back to 2000 years ago and just do exactly that, and it started with, you give us all your possessions so that we can be the apostles like back then. They laid it down to their feet. But you're saying they never got it right. They missed the message to a degree. They had those. It's like when you write a diary and you don't know what it means until later you come back to it. It's like, whoa, there it was. Like when he washed our feet, or when he refused to kill the soldiers, and he went with them and he allowed them to crucify him. That's when we saw God. And that was hard to probably, how do you make sense of that if you're like a go-getter and like, now we need a form, we need a shape, we need to keep it going, otherwise it'll die out or something.
Well, You know, it's not really a question of going back to the first century or not. Let me explain what I mean by that. Every movement, including a religious movement, every movement needs to have some kind of relationship with its origin story. Okay, otherwise you're just basically a new religious movement, or you become what, you know, in sociology they call, you become a reform movement, and eventually you get kicked out or you leave and you become basically a sect, except that a sect doesn't see itself as being a sect, it sees itself as the true kind of mothership, if you will. Yeah. Now, I said a minute ago, it's not really about going back to the first century or not. Well, it's partly that, but more importantly is which aspect of the first century are you going to go back to? Yeah. Because there is tremendous diversity. Plus, when people say they go back to early Christianity, what they actually mean, typically in my experience, and I've had countless discussions and on stage, you know, like roundtables and this and that and the other thing. In my experience, what people actually mean is they go back to the 2nd century. Oh, which is when everything that Jesus had decentralized the pyramid, he took it down. He took it down. He got rid of sacred holiness. In other words, he got rid of ritual, sacred space, sacred food, sacred time, sacred offices, pilgrimages, a temple at the center, the synagogue. Read about his relationship with the synagogues in the Gospels. Find a single, and again, there's another challenge, you know, find a single case where he endorses the way of being human that the synagogue endorses. Just one. And good luck. So he does away with all these things. A classic example would be Mark 7, for instance, where something that's absolutely core to the faith, you know, the Old Testament based faith at the time. And he endorsed the Old Testament for as far as it went, which was until him. Okay. But he goes to the Old Testament and he says, you know how it used to be said, you know, in terms of food, you can't eat this and you can't eat that. Why? Because food represented symbolically in those ancient cultures different realities of societal being, of morality and whatnot. That's the reason. The reason is not biological. And he said, I'm telling you something here. This is Mark 7. It is not what goes into your mouth, the food, that's the problem that humans have. It is what comes out of the mouth. And with one stroke, he eliminated the ritual system of the Old Testament. He didn't say it shouldn't have been there. He's quite okay that it was there, but those days are over. They're supposed to be over. But then in the 2nd century, when people are looking to erect, you know, power politics again, pyramid, and that becomes the model for everything after that, including just about every church you see, you drive past today, or you go and visit. When that happened, then they went back to Old Testament type spirituality, which was fine before Jesus, but it was not fine in light of Jesus. If you do that, you're basically saying that Jesus is ultimately irrelevant for how you do church. Do you really want to say that? Yeah. Well, if you do, then join the 12, because that was their choice. Yeah. Yeah. And only one of them eventually made it under kicking and screaming in chapter in Acts, Peter. Acts 10 and 11, that's the kicking and screaming, you know, when he needs the vision to send him out there to Cornelius. And then by 15, he finally gets it. And then he checks out of the story. We hear nothing from him anymore. The no-names have already taken over. And thank God that Peter checked out in a decent place. Yeah. We can't really claim that for the others. We just don't know.
Well, we sort of know that he died on the cross too, crucified, because John foreshadows.
We think so. We think so. Whether John is talking about specifically or not, we're not sure about. There are reports of this. They're later. They post-date the New Testament. They could be right. They could be wrong. But yes, he probably died in the early 60s, and he may well have died that martyr death. Same for Paul, but we also don't know how Paul died. Why not? Because there are all these parallels between Paul and Jesus in Acts. You know, Paul does similar things that he learned from Jesus. He's actually a great interpreter of Jesus. But the author stopped short at the end of Acts, telling us what happened to either Peter or Paul in terms of martyrdom. Why? Because if you take the parallel between them and Jesus that far, including their death, then you're in dangerous territory. Then you're basically setting them up to be celebrated as saints. And there are no saints in early Christianity, except in the sense that everyone's a saint who follows Jesus.
Oh man, just a side note, I imagine that if the people, you know, coming out of a cult and they're though I studied theology, so I was a childlike Bible reader, but also, you know, with some background in theology that I rejected as heresy, and then added on toxic reading of the Bible. It must be very exhausting for you to hear how people reason and how people use the Bible with the knowledge that you have, and then not be like, oh boy, where should I begin to help you see? So I would like to hear from you, definitely these two things. And I know there's no short answer. So the one thing is, how do we read the Bible without abusing ourselves, other people, instrumentalizing the Bible to control other people? And then also, how do we read the Bible? I have one right here. Without instrumentalizing, without abusing the Bible itself. So that's three layers: not abusing ourselves, not abusing other people, and then also not abusing the text. And then my other question will be, tell us about that origin story. Just a heads up for the viewers, that's what we're headed of next.
Okay, so as far as the interpretive question is concerned, here's a very crucial element to that. If we want to get that right, if we don't want to misuse and abuse the Bible and thereby misuse and abuse each other as a consequence, and that is, we cannot possibly call for or support the notion of a special interpretive approach that only applies to the Bible. That is not only I was going to say ridiculous, but that's a bit strong, but now I said it, I guess. That would be ridiculous in the sense that then you open the door to whatever the heck you want to do with the Bible. And that's exactly what we see happening.
That's a good point. I think
go ahead.
An example would be that we take one verse in one obscure chapter and we turn it into women are not allowed to cut their hair. And so they have this ridiculously long hair for even more ridiculous reasons and beliefs. Literally, I'm part of a Facebook community where a lot of people are from the United Pentecostal Church. And when they leave the church and they get an inch off of their tremendously long hair, they have anxiety attacks because they were told someone's going to die because you are cutting your hair now. So that's what you mean. That would be giving the Bible, because nothing else in your life are we reading and we're just like this one verse. Ooh, we have to make a whole religion out of this one. Disregard all of it, but this one verse. Go ahead.
Well, you see, this is the thing in seminary education. One of the things that students crave when they come to seminary, and sadly they are given it, typically, especially in the more conservative or more evangelical seminaries, one thing that they crave is they want that special insider knowledge that unlocks the Bible for them, so that when they then graduate as leaders and they do that leading, you know, they have those special powers, something like that. And you know what? Seminaries, they're often in financial trouble and have been for decades, and it's not getting better. And I'm not saying those are the main considerations, but that plays into it. Seminaries don't mind playing to the wishes of their constituents And if you as a professor don't do that, but you say to the students, hey, I don't care if you agree with me. In fact, it might be better if you don't, because then there's actual space for mutual learning. But I don't need you to agree with me. And therefore, I'm free to say things that I feel I need to say. If you do that instead of pandering to the perceived needs of your constituents, then you are free. And you are free to point out, for instance, that to argue for a special hermeneutic, a special interpretive approach to the Bible is absolutely uncalled for and deeply harmful, and actually becomes another foundational piece for systemic abuse, systemic spiritual abuse. So you see, this is the craziness. One of them anyway, when it comes to how people think about the Bible. We say things like the Bible is God's incarnate word. So God, God's communication is embodied in the Bible. Why? Because that way we can understand Revelation better. We can read, and if we can't read, then somebody's going to translate it for us, or whatever the case may be. Explain it to us. So we say that, fine. By the same token, we then say, oh, and by the way, the Bible has its own rules of interpretation. And thankfully, we, the leaders, know what they are because we learned them at seminary. Okay, now that is why I called it ridiculous earlier. Which one is it? Is it incarnational in favor of facilitating communication? Or is it a special deal that only the leaders are privy to, and they can leverage on you, and they can put the thumb screws on? Let me give you an example. I once, we were thinking of joining a church, a very large church in Minnesota, very large, and so we had to go to this Saturday thing. So some member event, and so I'm a theology professor, and I know when it's a good time to just keep quiet and say nothing. And I was being good, so I was there all Saturday, and I listened, and I filled out the little fill in the blank membership sheets as we went along, and I kept my thoughts to myself because there's much there that I just wanted to tear my hair out. But at the end of that day, literally at the end of that day, the biggest issue of all came up, and I still hadn't said anything all day. And the issue was money. And the guy at the front, the executive pastor, he made the point that this is a big church and it wants to grow even more, and it wants to attract people from even farther afield, which is the exact opposite what you have in the New Testament, which is decentralization. Basically house churches or little churches wherever they are, and no conglomeration. This is the exact opposite. This is centralization. This is empire building. And I don't even know why we didn't just kind of walk at the time, but we didn't. And I sat there, and so he said, this needs to be funded, because we have this crazy notion that somehow it's okay to spend 90+% of our money on ourselves. And then we somehow think that's being sacrificial to the world. I mean, it's just completely nuts, the way we think about these things often. And then he said, okay, this needs to be funded. And for that purpose, we need at least 10% from each of you, and actually more, because the New Testament wants you to give more than the 10%, which is totally not true. It's just completely baseless. But of course, he didn't go to the New Testament anyway. He went to the Old Testament, to the temple. So the thing that Jesus said is behind us because it represents sacred time and sacred space, all the things Jesus got rid of: sacred time, sacred space, sacred rituals, centralization, sacred foods, sacred robes to be worn, sacred procedures. And all of that, all of which Jesus got rid of, that very thing that he got rid of, and he kept it all off, is saying the temple will be a pile of rubble. And that's okay. Mark 13. All of that suddenly doesn't matter anymore, because that's the place where we can find a president, or however you pronounce it, precedent, depending where you come from. I lived in England for some time, of a big building being financed by its people.
Yeah.
And now that becomes the excuse
Yeah.
for giving your money sacrificially to the church. It's a ridiculous situation. That's just one little example. And it is based on not just bad interpretation, but often non-interpretation. And how does it get covered up? If somebody were to say something, and I did say something at the end, and I was immediately told off that I should know better as a professor than to make the other believers, new believers, insecure by my question, when I said, hey, why are we suddenly going to the Old Testament when the New Testament, has no such notion? And that's very lightweight way of asking the question, but that was not appreciated. But anyway, how does it get covered up, this kind of approach to the Bible? It gets covered up by saying to people the Bible needs its own special set of interpretation, and only the leaders have access to it. And that is ridiculous and harmful.
Yeah, and you were right to say that was one example of many we could come up with, and that surely is systemic. And so we're going out of order with how I thought our conversation was going to go, which is perfectly fine. Good. But that's your beef with the organized institution of church, one of them, that it is setting up people to become the self-referential environment where you have to pay to keep it going and finish my sentence.
Well, it's a way of managing the majority. And that is not acceptable. We can either go with the gospel and the liberation and the setting free of the gospel, and we can talk about that. We need to talk about that for a minute. In a minute, we can either go with that, or we can just say, hey, we'll just find a sexier way of managing each other, or managing top down. Yeah. And that's what churches basically do. And that's not acceptable. It's theologically not acceptable. It's deeply non-continuous with the origin story. What's the point of saying this is a Christian thing when there is zero continuity with the origin story? So what is the origin story? The origin story is, in a nutshell, and this is not just New Testament, this is the entire Bible, right? The origin story is that a humanity that becomes too selfish, Genesis, needs to be ideally not forced back, kind of muscled back into being non-selfish, because that's not relational. God is relational, even from day one, from chapter 1, from verse 1 in the Old Testament. God is relational and wants to be relational with humanity. So when humanity goes berserk in terms of selfishness, the way to address that is to woo humanity back into a relationship rather than to force humanity. How is that done? You take an extremely unlikely people, the people of Israel, a bunch of tribes who people hardly knew anything about, and you make them a quote unquote model people. Certainly not perfect, but they model the struggle towards something better, the struggle towards a return of humanity to something relational that is in keeping with God and with creation. That's how you do it. The issue with that is, the weakness with that is that those people may suck, and they did. And the Old Testament is full of it, full of that. I mean, you just pick pick Judges. Pick Judges as an example. Pick anything you want. Pick any of the prophets. They're terrible. They're terrible at this. So they don't do what they're supposed to be doing. Instead, they just want to kind of float up to the top of humanity and rule the roost from up there, which is what got humanity into trouble in the first place. And that, by the way, of course, is the model that most churches emulate. ironically. So anyway, so they're no good at it. Israel wasn't good at it. And Romans is very, among many other places, but Romans 9 through 11 in particular is super, super clear on all of this. Ephesians 2, super clear. Plenty of passages. I'm not going to go there now, but so Jesus comes along and he takes a lot of terminology that in the Old Testament refers to Israel, like sons of God or son of man. Those words, by the way, in the Old Testament refer to Israel. They don't refer to a future Messiah, they refer to Israel. He takes our servant in Isaiah. He takes those very evocative, highly symbolic words of what Israel was supposed to be. It was to represent God to the world and to woo the world back as a kind of model humanity where the world says, we want some of that. You know, I'll have what they're having. What was that? When Harry Met Sally. You know, I'll have.
Yeah, right.
Okay, never mind.
Forget it though. I watched the movie.
So then Jesus takes all those terms that are Israel terms and he applies them to himself. Well, what do we think is the message of that? The message of that is, I'm going to live out the kind of Israel the world actually needs and hasn't gotten yet. And that's what he invites the 12 disciples into. And they're all gung-ho initially, and they drop the nets and they follow and they're being sacrificial until they're not. And they say, that's not actually the vision of humanity that we want. And in that sense, ironically, the 12 disciples, well, minus Peter, because he kind of just rounds the corner last second in Acts 15, 10, 11, and then 15. The disciples who do not want the kind of humanity that Jesus wants, they actually, sure enough, become the blueprint for the kind of churches we have today. How about that?
Yeah. So the origin story is to become the kind of humanity that is driven by love and embraces humanity, and that there is that is our sacred space, that we accept we are here as humans in this beautiful world, and love is our law. That's very uncomplicated in a way, but again, it's hard, because how do you organize people around it? How do you make money off of that? I don't know.
You don't, because you're supposed to be sacrificial instead of making money. So you don't. You can't. The origin story is eminently unsuitable for making money.
It's so hard. So hard, though. I'm thinking of churches who have these special ways of enticing people to help fund new PA system. We need new pews, we need new this and that. And it's like, I get it all, but it reminds me of Luther's time, when they used to build these colossus of beautiful churches, which, well, we still have them today, but people were dying in the streets and giving with their last possession just to not go to hell. What is it? Penance letters, Ablassbrief in German. It seems what I've seen is now they're not turning it into, okay, you can buy yourself a little bit less time in purgatory with this, but it's still kind of this, hey, we need to keep this going, and then this needs to be nicer, so it is more appealing to more people, so more people can get saved or can become part of this family. I don't know.
So one way you can ignore the origin story, which is one of self-giving rather than selfishness. One way you can ignore it is to say, oh yeah, it's about self-giving. Fair enough. But it's you have to give yourself, you have to give your heart. And then when the bus runs you over, you're going to end up in heaven, which is after death, and it's up there. Something like that.
Yeah.
Now, the New Testament or the Old Testament for that matter, doesn't talk about heaven as either in the future or up there. Heaven, and you said this really beautifully a minute ago, you said the sacred space is right here. And that is thoroughly Jewish thinking. And that's the same thinking you get in the Lord's Prayer, for instance. right? It is here and it is now. But the way you can pay lip service to the self-givingness and the sacrificial nature of the story, while at the same time unhinging it, is to attach it to a view of heaven that is in the future and up there, preferably so far in the future that's after death, so you can live however you want. You just choose whatever church you're comfortable with, and that's it, because you don't really have to do much, because you just attend. You mentioned the pews. What's the point of pews? The point of pews is to make the masses look to the leaders at the front.
No,
That's hardly the model of humanity that Jesus was promoting, was it? At no shape or form was he promoting that. Now you might say, and I've heard this a lot, I've had thousands of pastors among my students, and of course they are seriously challenged by some of the things I said in class. And so we have open conversations about this. That's the whole point of learning, right? You disagree and you explore the space in between. And so I've had pastors who said, well, there's this research by University of Minnesota or by whoever, and it's true, there is this research that says humans need to be organized. They cannot not be organized. But the kicker is this, that only is true once you reach a certain critical mass, if you will. And culturally, that might depend on the context. There's some cultures where you can have 5 people together and one of them feels the need to organize and the other 4 say go for it. Most cultures don't. At 5 you can still kind of do it. You still have at least the capacity to do it by some sort of shared leadership, like a friend group that doesn't have a leader. With some cultures, you might have 12 people without having to organize it. But once you're, let's say, 20 people, then a lot of what we found in communities, in small communities, is that people who come out of the shell and who actually contribute and who have their own way of leading, not top-down leading, but leading with whatever they have to, whatever expertise they have, that also is true leadership. Yeah. And sometimes the best leadership. They come out of their shell, and it's a beautiful thing to say, but the thing grows to 18 or 20 people, and these people go back into their shell again. That suggests that rather than to read the research on large groups needing to organize, how about we avoid large groups? And how about we go with this approach that says little friendship groups, welcoming, sacrificial, self-giving friendship groups that don't need to spend 10% plus of their income just to run themselves. They can actually give that away if they want. How about that?
Right, absolutely. And what you're saying sounds so radical in our culture, where it is all about the bigger your group is, the more successful you are, and then the shinier your building needs to be. I heard, oh man, I'm not prepared to really talk about this, but just you probably have heard of the research of the blue zones, the happiest places on the planet. And so I listened to a man speak about that. And one of the cultures he mentioned, it was something Asia. It's something in Asia. And there are culturally people raised from childhood on till the day they take their last breath. And they're part of these very small, intimate friendship groups. And they lead their lives together. So a woman will have her 4, 5 best friends from childhood, and they stay together. That's just the culture. You might maybe move a little bit down the road or something, but somehow you weave your life together. If there's heartache, you suffer together. If there's joy, then you celebrate together. You share in your life. And apparently that is what connects centennial people that get 100 years or older. Those are the people, and they're not just getting old miserably. They're considered, they have a quality of life, they're happy. Right. So we keep saying, well, we need church, we need community. Okay, but that's a lot of people, and again, we have the hierarchy, and a lot of people who are not bringing their gifts. They're supposed to be okay with showing up and listening and consuming, and then they're told, well, you can read a text and maybe that meets your need of participate, I don't know, or help in the child zone. When science research backs up the notion small, organic, but true, like even culturally normal relationships are where really the magic can happen for humanity. And now imagine they also share their faith.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I have plenty of church experience over the decades in different countries, and in each of them for many years, different churches and so on. And I have plenty of speaking experience in churches, large and small. You know, I've spoken in front of 4 people or 4,000 people, whatever. When you here's the thing, what I've seen in terms of churches is they're not really about community. They should be, but they're not. That's the lesson we should really draw from a certain size. We shouldn't draw the conclusion that humanity needs to be organized, because that's the only way you can have a large group. That is technically true, but it's also irrelevant and actually toxic ultimately to pursue that as a goal rather than to see it as a reality to be avoided. But there's the other piece to this, which is that churches are based on attendance models. It's attendance. I mean, heck, there's more interaction in a classroom at school or at the university where you can actually raise your hand and ask a question. I mean, there's more. If anything, is a model, closer model, not ideal, but closer than what churches are doing in terms of what kind of humanity are we advertising to the world, than just about any other group out there, any other societal group in the world has a better shot than churches. Churches are strictly attendance oriented. And why is that? It is because leaders, denominations, you mentioned earlier the situation, you know, with Catholicism and Martin Luther around 1500 and so on. We just went past the 500-year anniversary of that about 3 years ago. You look at church leaders, at denominations, the power brokers, the seminaries, and so on. They have, through the back door, fully bought into these notions of holiness and sacredness that made sense during Old Testament times, that make zero sense in light of Jesus. So that's the runaround, it's the go around Jesus back to whatever understanding of humanity Jesus came to overcome, or as he says, to bring it to its proper conclusion.
Yeah.
You know, Matthew 5, for instance, we're now doing this end around Jesus. He might as well not have come. He might as well not have died. He might as well not have taught. He might as well not have picked 12 disciples, because who gives a rip, frankly, because we're doing whatever we're doing, and we're doing it worse than, quote unquote, the world. Like I say, in that university, so I've taught in different universities, people can interrupt me if they want. But when I speak at a church, which doesn't happen so often, because a lot of churches, they kind of go, do we want this? But when I speak at a church, I'd be quite happy for people to interrupt me. But then I'm you know, if I were to suggest that, for instance, then, and I'm not suggesting it because I know how this goes, then the answer is no. We need to be orderly. Churches are not about community. They're not about interaction. They're not about modeling a humanity worth having to the world. They're just another corporate event at prayer.
Yeah. How can Joe Schmo, after being told with the Bible, you have to obey your leader, or you might not go to heaven, because it says in Hebrew 17 verse 13, to give them no grief, that's actually earlier, and joyfully be obedient so that they can give a account of you. How, first of all, why writer of Hebrew? Why make something that can be so easily abused? And how could you read that as a person later and be like, yeah, I was right to leave my toxic group and not submit myself to someone else now? Say more.
I mean, clearly in Hebrews, well, there are two things going on in Hebrews. Part of it is that Hebrews is operating in a kind of in an intermediate world between, I talked earlier about two notions of God's people. You have one based on sacred times and sacred space and all those things, essentially based on the Mosaic covenant in the Old Testament. You have that, and then you have the Jesus vision. And what Hebrews does is and we don't know an awful lot about the circumstance of Hebrews, but one thing we do know, it was clearly written to communities that were in that gray zone and that were struggling and that were still, on the one hand, based on a synagogal model. Synagogues were like, in the couple of centuries before Jesus, and then especially during and after Jesus, synagogues were like these signposts to the temple. They were a function of centralization. Right. And so Hebrews writes to people who are now doing the Christian thing in that manner. They're like Christian synagogues.
Yeah.
So Hebrews, rather than say, are you kidding me? We need to move beyond all that, which frankly, someone like Paul absolutely says. But Paul is a different person, and Paul is talking in different contexts. Hebrews doesn't do that. Hebrews kind of takes people by the hand and works with them in that intermediate zone between one kind of understanding humanity and another kind, the idea being to gently kind of move them over. Now, Paul is never accused of being gentle, to my knowledge. He doesn't do that. He just said, well, what the heck are you doing, right? Galatians, for instance. So you see different authors having different kind of rhetorical intonations, if you will, of how they try and lead people. Now, those leaders are supposed to be accountable. They're supposed to be accountable, and they're supposed to be models of the gospel. And to that extent, they should be obeyed. To that extent. And that piece gets often left out when people sort of willy-nilly go to Hebrews 13:17 and say, you guys should listen to me and submit to me because I'm your leader. That ignores a lot of things. It ignores the piece that I just said. It also ignores the fact that leadership is always plural in the New Testament, always, always, always. And I don't know if you've ever noticed that passages in the New Testament talk about leaders and pastors and elders and teachers, like Ephesians 4:11, for instance. Somehow, strangely, those plurals get lost.
Plurals.
When it comes to how the plurals get lost, and that is just evil. No, we can't lose that. Leadership has to be plural. It has to be plurally accountable, and it has to be gift driven. Most passages that are used from the New Testament for supporting offices, they have nothing to do with offices. The New Testament isn't interested in offices. It is interested in talents, in gifting. And so leadership needs to account for that. And that means that leadership moves with the different gifts that people have. There are ways when, I've been part of communities where I had leadership roles. And there are ways where in those same communities at the same time, where there's no way I would take a leadership role because I wouldn't know what I'm talking about.
Right.
But somebody else, you mentioned Joe Schmo. Joe Schmo may be a great leader for that.
Yeah.
And so Jane Doe, Joe Schmo, and whoever else is there, leadership needs to be flexible. It needs to account for that. But for that, you need to have small groups. But one other thing about this, about how to avoid the abusive situations and how to, first of all, unmask them. Interpretation, that thing that I called hermeneutics, is absolutely crucial for this. Absolutely crucial. We need to know how to interpret well. Interpret not just the Bible, but interpret stuff in general and interpret each other and ourselves. Remember how I said we dare not call for a special hermeneutics just for the Bible?
Yeah.
The thing is, hermeneutics, how we interpret, how we interact with our brains with everything else around us, including ourselves. It's the one human activity that nobody can ever escape, even for a second.
Give an example.
Escape theology. Well, you just neurologically, our brains are always interpretive. We're always interpreting. You cannot tell your brain, hey, shut down for a second. No human has that capacity. We are condemned to interpret. Okay, that sounds pretty bad. It's actually cool. That is the human energy. We consistently, that's the question. Constantly, I should have said, interpret. It is not possible to shut down our brains. So, an example, if I have your attention, you have my attention, because we said, let's do this. But if I didn't have your attention, and if you didn't want to take any notice of me, and you decide, who is this guy? I'm just going to ignore him. You know, like in an elevator, you walk into an elevator and some people are so it's so awkward. They pretend the others aren't there. Well, everyone is interpreting the situation. You cannot avoid it. You cannot say, okay, I'm in an elevator and I'm really not going to care that there are other people. I'm just going to shut my brain down until the elevator stops or something like that. You can't do it. But let's suppose people were committed to doing that. Let's suppose you were committed to ignore me. Then all I have to do, and this is my example, and it'll work unfailingly every time, always, in any context. All I have to do is tell you a story. Doesn't matter if it's cool or stupid or whatever, any old story. That will engage your imagination and you will not be able to resist it. No human can resist story because we are narrative beings. And we understand that neurologically, but we also understand it in real life. I tell you a story, you cannot ignore it. You may hate it. You may stick fingers in your ears and go, la, 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 la. That just acknowledges that you've been unable to ignore it. So we're storied beings. So I would tell people, if you suspect, especially if you suspect abuse in any shape or form, but just by being a human, I would tell people, invest in the one activity that is so quintessentially human that no one can ever escape it. People can escape theology, they can ignore it, they can not do it, politics, anything that ends with ology, sociology, or whatever, advertising, they can move away into the outback of Australia and hide behind a rock or whatever. They can ignore anything in life, even faith. They can never ignore the need for the brain to be constantly, there we go again, constantly interpretively engaged. That, investing in that to become better interpreters of anything is the best defense, to my mind, against spiritual abuse.
So walk us through a very practical example. Just make up a scenario. Like you're part of a group and you're suspecting something isn't quite right here.
Well, I mean, this is not a spiritual, the one I gave earlier is not a spiritual abuse example, but it's the same, it's the same mechanics. You know, what I said about the executive pastor and the Saturday membership class. That is not abuse, but it is a serious misuse. It's a misuse of the Bible. It's a misuse of a position of power, which of course is a key ingredient in spiritual abuse. So there is that, but other typical common examples to do with spiritual abuse are when somebody exercises toxic authority over you that does not affirm your humanity, but invites you or forces you to reduce your humanity. Okay, so if somebody says, for instance, I don't care if you're gifted in this or that area. In this church, you're not in a position to speak up on that issue because you're a woman or because you are whatever. That is spiritual abuse. And if for someone who watches that and who can interpret that situation because they've invested in this thing that I've been talking about, and kind of call it the fancy word, hermeneutics. If see that and you can interpret it, now you feel empowered to actually do something about it and call out the leader and empower the person who's been abused and so on.
Yeah. So you're saying the invitation is to learn to pay attention and then begin thinking.
To learn the actual skills. It's very, very specific. There are actual skills that we need to cultivate as humans when it comes to interpretation. So to make it specific, I used to be taught in school, both in Germany and in the United States, because remember, I graduated from high school twice.
Yeah.
3 years in between, so crazy. I was taught on both sides of the pond that to interpret a text, for instance, or to interpret something spoken, something verbal, means I need to see 3 components in order to interpret what's going on. The 3 components are: there's a sender, there's a message, and there's a receiver. So if you wanted to use football as an example, you could say there's a quarterback, there is the football, and there's the wideout who catches the thing, hopefully, and runs it into the end zone. But that model of understanding, of interpreting, is deeply, deeply flawed. And it opens the door to all kinds of abuse. Because if you take any of those components and let's say you are an expert, and let's say you consider yourself a leader, and let's say you are in danger of abusing those that you consider yourself in leadership of, you're going to be tempted of using any of those 3 components, and with your special knowledge that you claim, you're going to massage any one of them in such a way that you maintain your position of power and authority. Now, if you're at the receiving end of that and you suspect that something is wrong here, and if you had the social kind of, or the emotional power to be able to do this with someone who claims to be an authority over you, you could ask them, what is your model for interpretation? It seems a very unnatural model. They might say, well, how would you do it? You might say, it's not about a receiver, a sender sending a message to a receiver, and we call that meaning, and to catch the ball is like good interpretation. No, good interpretation is very different from this very common model that I just referenced, is very different. Good interpretation asks not what is being transmitted here, but what is being done. It's action, it's activity. If I say to someone, let's say I owe someone money, and we come together and I say, I'll pay you back. What action am I unleashing here? Maybe it's promissory. You will get your money back, don't worry. Or maybe it's a threat. You'll get your money back. You know, that's very different. The so-called illocution, the energy behind the communication is different. That's what we should be asking about. The 2 things we should be asking about: what's the energy, irrespective of the words used. The words, who cares about the words? It's the energy ultimately that matters. But we've always been taught that it's about the words. And that opens the door to abuse, because you can use any old dictionary and argue and find an example of any old situation that supports whatever you're doing as a leader, and nobody has a comeback, because how would they come back at you without knowing hermeneutics? But if you know hermeneutics, you know it's not about the words, what we call the locution. It's about the energy, what we call the illocution, and the intended transformative effect on the other and self, what we call perlocution. That's a practical example of how knowing interpretation can really protect you against someone who twists words in front of your eyes. I could give you plenty other examples. This one has to do with speech as action. I actually do this whole course on something I started a few years ago called Warehouse Theology, where we do this kind of thing, lots of it. But that's an example for you.
I'll put a link up for that in the description too. But so you are saying, about, for instance, Hebrew 13:17.
Mhm.
If it's not so much about the words that are being used, which words get lost in translation, we know that as Germans
Mhm.
who have learned English, and how even just 50 years of language transformation changes the meaning of words. Like just the word gay, for instance. There's Christmas songs. Here we are in our gay, happy Christmas attire, but now gay has a different meaning.
Right.
And it's not even that long ago. And so obviously we have to consider that. So you're saying the spirit or the energy, you call it energy, what's the oomph, the intention of what's being said. So when it says, obey your leaders and submit to them, for they keep watch over your souls as those who will give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with grief, for this would be unprofitable for you. So they're basically saying, don't be distrusting of people who are trying to help you mature.
Right.
Yeah.
So the assumption is that the leadership situation is not toxic. The assumption is that the leadership situation is challenging for the community, but it is not toxic.
Yeah, right.
And that implication, that's another important hermeneutical thing. Implication is always more important than explication. Okay, so if I say to someone, I'll pay you back, and my implication is that I want to make the other person whole, then that is more important than what words I'm using.
Yeah.
And you know, I was just reminded some years ago, I was driving in a rental car through the desert of Morocco. I've been to Morocco many times, and driving through the desert is an amazing thing. And I was driving through the desert, and it was Ramadan, and I saw no one for a couple of hours. I just saw occasionally these little signs somewhere sticking out of the sign. But then I suddenly saw this big thing, and it was an overturned truck. And the truck driver, it was an 18-wheeler, had overturned. The truck driver was sitting in the sun and was completely catatonic, completely unresponsive. And I didn't speak, so I speak French, but Morocco, you have French and Arabic. He didn't speak Arabic. He didn't speak French, only Arabic. I assumed, well, definitely Arabic. Whether he had French was kind of debatable, but he definitely had Arabic. I didn't speak Arabic. But I went to him. It was Ramadan. The guy was completely out of energy and dehydrated and so on. And I went to him and I talked to him and I said all kinds of stuff to him. It didn't matter what language I used. I wanted him to be assured that someone's looking after him. I couldn't persuade him to come with me. I was just going to turn around and take him back to the city and then can get help. He didn't take my water. I left my water. He didn't want me to help because it's Ramadan, and I left my water with him. I'm sure he didn't touch it. So I made it clear to him ultimately that I understand he's not coming with me. I understand Ramadan, etc., but I'm going to drive back and I want him to know this. And I illustrated this to him using hands and pointing at the car and this and that I'm going to go back and to where I came from, and I'm going to find help, and they're going to come and they're going to look after him. And I don't know what happened ultimately, but that's what I did. I went back and I got help, and they said, we're on our way. Now, the language didn't really matter. It would have helped. It would have made it slightly easier. But ultimately, it's the energy. What good is it if I use the right words, but I'm being, what's the word here? Discouraging to him. What if I use the right words, but my energy is, oh man, you're going to die. You know, so it's about the energy. It's not about the words. I wish seminaries understood that. I wish a lot of professional development understood that. I wish pastors understood that. People need to be empowered when it comes to interpreting well, and that will have all kinds of benefits, including seeing abuse for what it is and feeling empowered to move past it or through it.
Oh, that is a powerful story. Yes. So maybe this can be our concluding thoughts. Research that's been done on plants that either shrivel up or thrive depending on the sound waves of what they are exposed to. And we know the feeling, we know that there's things like when a dog comes in the room, unless you're allergic and you run away from dogs, but how that there's a calm that comes, or when you see the ocean, or whatever your thing is, that just has this magical effect on calming you. And
right.
you tell, this is good for me, I'm thriving, versus the opposite. And so you're saying, or you're reminding me basically that language is made up. It's, you know, we created it. It's German, way too complicated. But here we are, and we get caught and lost in the words when the feeling of it all, the intent, the energy, is it supposed to raise you up or is it supposed to tear you down? And we feel the difference that so it sounds like you're basically going along with what I have always been saying to the audience, which is do tune in into your feeling, paying attention in that sense, that you can say, I might not understand why this rubs me the wrong way, but it does, and it is worth exploring. And as you, like you did, you raised your voice eventually, and you edited yourself so successfully for that whole Saturday membership seminar. But then, you know, just this one last thing broke the camel's back, and you gently express why this rubbed you the wrong way, but ever so carefully, just basically asking a question that he understood, being very critical. But then you observe the reaction. How does authority react when you do call out a discrepancy or a problem or a question, you know, maybe a critical question? And then what happens? And then we see empire at work, because as you said, you will be pushed out of it because they can't have rebels in it. That's just not acceptable.
Yeah, so I think my main contribution to the super important, in many ways, tragic situation surrounding spiritual abuse being such a reality, my contribution is mostly in the area of empowering humans in terms of their basic human abilities to interpret situations, interpret themselves, to be empowered, and to gain the energy from that, to seek the help that they need, also for others to give the help that they also need, namely need to give. That is the crucial thing, but that's in the realm of the systemics, of, you know, the structures of abuse, if you like. That's where I put my effort. But then there are many others. This is very much a team sport here. You know, it's not a sport at all. That's a bad metaphor, but you know what I mean. It takes people who don't look at the systemic so much. I have people almost every day who say, "Oh, you always go on about the institution." Yeah, right. Somebody has to.
Right.
But then what about people who are much better than me at being alongside someone and kind of cry with them? You know, there's that, and there are many other things, and many of those I'm not good at. I just happen to know a little bit about this aspect here, and that's what got me into hermeneutics in the first. Well, what I told you already, but one other thing was when I did my PhD in London and Cambridge, I realized that the thing that I submitted at the end, and it passed, and it was all good, and I published it, and I checked all the boxes and all of that. That I realized that satisfied the needs of the academy at the level that I, you know, that I wanted it to. And now, having checked that box, I should really get into actual real issues, which is how do humans tick? And how do I become a better interpreter? I read stuff that I wrote in my own PhD and I cringe and I think, why didn't I learn interpretation better before I wrote my PhD? But who cares? It passed, you know.
Yeah.
But my own students, and I have plenty of PhD students, they study with me here in the US. They don't have to move to England, but they are registered with the university in England. Yeah. The one thing that I insist on, they either have or get before we start is hermeneutics, interpretive skills, because there are plenty of PhDs up and down the world who don't have the foggiest how to interpret anything except a tiny little area of research. I think in German we call it Fachidioten.
Yeah. Right. And I love, you told me that when we went for a walk, and it took me some time to wrap my mind around that concept, but you were saying that this one thing needs to be true for everything. And I think you're so right, because when you listen to your gut, when you pay attention, when you interpret a situation correctly, when you can understand intent, you have a head start, you have a better shot at avoiding any kind of abuse. And so it's not just about spiritual abuse, any kind. If you understand what the intent is, especially for children, the intent is of some dangerous people, then they can remove themselves from situations quicker. So to me, this is really a human truth. Not just Fachidiot, like in this one area this applies. No, what we're talking about is really the big picture of humanity, and our big problem that we sometimes are just like deers in headlight and are taught to be helpless and just kind of trust, which trust is not a bad thing, but we have to pay attention and interpret correctly. I so appreciated you taking the time today and sharing some of your massive amount of thoughts with me here in my audience. I'm very happy about that the person put us together, and I think we will be talking in the future again. But that's jumping ahead. So thank you so much. And you said many times, Thorsten, you're welcome for people to call you a liar or a heretic right to your face via email. So I'll put your email.
Oh, of course.
All day long, please.
Of course. I started my own little YouTube channel. It's just super tiny, much smaller than yours at this point. And somebody and hardly any comments yet, and hardly any subscribers yet. It's pretty new. And somebody just told me in a comment that I'm the embodiment of the Antichrist.
Ooh.
And I thought, wow, I guess if nothing else, struck a nerve somewhere. But it's not my favorite description or my favorite kind of category for me at all. I think of myself very much as a actually person of faith who's trying to be helpful. So in that sense, it stinks a little. But you know what? If a good conversation came out of this, that'd be amazing.
Right.
It may not. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I think people need to realize that it's pretty obvious, just looking at the history, that the Antichrist is going to come officially from Austria.
Oh, okay. Good to know.
Yeah. And I don't know, it's going to be Adolf II or something. He's going to pose as a German, but he's actually from Austria.
Okay. Yeah, no, I'm an actual German. I have a passport.
Yes, I do too. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you so much, and we'll stay in touch.
We will. Good talking to you.